And I will kick us off. Hello, everybody, and welcome back for our final session of day 2 of the Peralta Online Equity Conference. We're really pleased to have you all here. This is day 2, so that means the focus of each of the sessions is more of a discussion. And so while there will be slides to ground us in different points of view and different facts and figures that we may not be aware of, we are hopeful that you will engage with the presenters. And so first and foremost, we want to make sure you know that you don't need to turn your camera on to participate. We are being recorded, but that's up to you. If you also do not want to have your voice captured for any reason, then you can use the chat to share your questions, your comments, or your resources that you want to share. And then either I, the moderator, or Elle or Anna will repeat it for the recording's benefit and answer as we go. And then last but not least, if you would like to use the captions, the tool is at the bottom of the Zoom toolbar. It's called the captions button. Or if your screen is minimized a little bit, it might be hidden under the more button with the 3 dots. And so you just have to click that more button and captions will show up as an option on the menu that pops up. But we have the chat ready and waiting for your questions, your comments, and your ideas. And I am going to hand the microphone over to Elle Dimopoulos and Dr. Anna Mills for their session, AI as Access and Accessibility.
Hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you for making it to the end of the day. Like I was saying before we got started, this is going to focus more on the discussion part of the topic. I do have some slides to ground us in our thinking, but since we have the lovely Dr. Mills here, I want to make sure we take that opportunity to fully engage with this topic. So before we get started, however, I just want to give a quick shout out to our non-sighted folks in the audience, if there are any. I'm a light-skinned female presenting person in a black top with burgundy glasses and short black hair. And in lieu of a larger program style land acknowledgement, I urge you to reach out to your local communities of Indigenous folk or First Peoples to see how you can turn advocacy into action. So with that, let's get started with the screen share. All right. All right, everybody can see my screen? Here we go. So just a little bit of an introduction. We're going to go through with our learning objectives with tensors and tokens, some meaning making, access and accessibility, some of the harms and risks, and then we're going to throw it over to discussion, and I'll stop the share so we can fully engage without having the distraction of the slides. So I know you've probably heard a lot about AI and generative AI, narrow AI. What does this all mean, right? Well, I want to take a step back a little, right? As somebody who has some roots in information technology, in science, I'm a data scientist myself. I want you to really think about if we can break down what some of this AI is doing. Another analogy that we can use is how we break down these sentence fragments. I don't know if anybody has this experience in their past, but echo back to primary school and how you diagram sentences. This is exactly how some of the tensor and tokenization scripts work. So for instance, if we took this sentence, the best bagels can still be had for about $40.99 and change in New York, must be something in the water. Well, how would an AI parse that token? Would you include $4.99? Would it think that the period in $4.99 is the end of the sentence? You know, how would it deal with the slang? Would we include even $4.99 and change as one single unit? This is a real big issue just in the simple fact of trying to create meaning out of these sentence tokens. Really, AI doesn't do any meaning making, right? It doesn't have cultural context clues. It doesn't know that, of course, Frankel's in Brooklyn are the best bagels in New York, and you can fight me on that. Moving on. So again, thinking about models, training sets, knowledge domains, these, I'm sure you've been exposed to these types of thought processes and concepts and vocabularies today, but I really want you to focus in on what are the ways of knowing? Is there a there for AI, for instance? What is happening in the data model itself, the large language model? Is there transparency there in how it was created? Is it been created with adversarial AI? Has it been, self-learning? Has it been an unlearned AI? Or as we learned in our previous session, is it a very focused, narrow data set, which we just input really specific domain level questions into? I think a good example of this is, I don't know if you've heard of Kata or Go, the board game. It is a really good predictor of AI algorithm success. A few years ago, they programmed an AI algorithm to beat the world's best Go player, and that was previously thought impossible. However, a few years later, and I have a link to the website and the paper in my resources section, they were actually able to trick the AI using some adversarial domain attacks, right? Looking at the ways of knowing, because that AI didn't know that there's a there. It doesn't know that there's a board or that it exists in the world, or there are white pieces and black pieces on the board game. So what they did was they essentially tricked it because it doesn't have meaning in the world. It doesn't experience anything, right? And they taught a very novice level player who hadn't played Go ever. And after 2 weeks using this attempt and technique, won 13 out of 14 matches. So that's something to be said when you're thinking about how AI really learns, or rather doesn't learn about the world. Getting to the meat of this presentation about access and accessibility. Well, obviously we know that machine translation and captions, we're using some right now, right? We can use it for content generation. We could use it for automated captions. But I want to take a second and pause here and think about audio description. I don't know if anybody is aware of audio description, but it's when you're really describing the meaning of a scene, right? A great example I like to use is the difference between the captions in the movie Rocky as they're running up the stairs, right? Triumphant, doing the training montage, right? Well, the captions usually are just music note, montage, music note. That doesn't tell me anything about the scene, but audio description would say, there's a groundswell of people following behind Rocky as they triumphantly march up the stairs in exuberation, right? That's creating meaning from the scene, right? And that's really what we as people can do, rather than something like automated captions or machine translation can do. However, going back to some of the advantages, there are some high opportunities for speech synthesis, right? And I know some people might be wary about, well, is something going to capture my voice and then be able to talk like me? Probably. You can do it right now. Actually, it's not that difficult with the right tools. However, think about it in this way. What if suddenly you didn't have access to your voice anymore, right? Through any kind of um, accident or trauma, and then you had those recordings of your speech. And then now with AI, you can use technology to talk not only in a robotic voice to access the world, but you can actually talk in your own voice, right? Something to consider. Obviously, this has second language learning potential, right? Getting a grasp of, well, what are we really talking about when we translate one language to another? Can we give ourselves a little leg up? And oh, okay, I see how that's written. Maybe I'll throw it through. ChatGPT is the favorite here during this conference, but there are a ton of other APIs and bots out there that will give you five examples, 10 examples. Here's how you could say this from this particular translation. I think that speaking to the international and broad appeal of this very conference, this has some important content delivery and communication access and equity benefits, right? Second brain applications. My favorite for second brain applications is Notion, right? Lots of people create their whole schedules and they can schedule out through various methods, Kanban or any of these other things for really tracking their life. This is similar to a step up to say somebody wearing like an Apple Watch, right? Really getting into that data metrics and really thinking about how we're going to organize our life. Now, that doesn't necessarily have its only purpose in organization for folks who might have, let's say, ADD or ADHD, but this also has an access and accessibility component with tools such as screen readers, read and write, all of these different tools that are coming out, Glean. There's a bunch of them out there, which will take a few snippets of your own notes and create an outline for you, or take a audio of a lecture and distill it down to what it thinks are the 5 talking points. And then you write your own notes to expand upon those, right? So in that way, it really helps you as that guide on the side that gives you that extra tutor boost, right? Whether it's helping you, flesh out a rough draft or do some brainstorming or, any kind of those reference type, first draft, I need to get started materials. Now, this I think is really interesting. I don't know if anybody can post in the chat if they have any experience with VR, AR, and mind-body connections, thinking about using AI to, along with these types of technologies to treat folks who might have PTSD, right? Or thinking about STEM applications. I was talking to a professor just the other day about navigating through a virtual cadaver because there's a cadaver shortage, right? And so you get to practice on a virtual body before you actually get into med school, for instance, or going deep into a diagram of an atom, right? So hopefully we can finally ditch Bohr's model and get some 3D representation, right? Another really interesting aspect of this is a human interface device accessibility feature. For instance, I just was reading about a really innovative touchpad like you would see on your MacBook Pro or your laptop, but it actually comes in like a mouthpiece and sits on the roof of your mouth, and you can navigate your computer using your tongue because your tongue has the same dexterity as a finger. You won't be able to do that without AI, right? And that's a really great way for folks to then get back into using computers and really getting the most out of their experience. Um, so now we come dun 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 to harms and risks, right? And I think might be able to jump in here as soon as we're done with the slide about opportunity costs, right? Writing is thinking. I won't expound on this because I think she has some good thoughts to say on it, but also data literacy and privacy, right? I think to me, this is more of a human problem, not a AI problem, right? Because we've always had issues with data literacy and information literacy, and we really need to start teaching folks, if you post anything into ChatGPT, into the prompt, with the exception of some of the flags that Jay just recently did like a week ago, all of that is going into their data set. If you search the web using any search engine, it goes into SEO or their data set. So they're mining your data. Do you have the rights to, let's say, post your student's essay into these data models, right, for checking? Because they might be harvesting that student's data or your data as well. The outsourcing of economic labor and fast lane capital, is like I like to call it. I think this was brought up in a few of the sessions where what happens when we have a really good ChatGPT 4.0 or some really great API that's integrated into a killer app, let's say, but it costs money, right? What's going to happen to the students who are underrepresented who can't afford that? Now they're in competition with students who can. That's definitely an equity issue. And also, lastly, talking about bigger, faster, stronger models, right? I've rolled my own LLM on my personal computer, and let me tell you, it generates a lot of heat. So not something I would recommend folks doing, especially in the summer. So that's it. There's my questions slide, and I'll stop my screen share here, and we can get on to the questions.
Do you want me to talk about the writing is thinking piece?
Yes, please.
Okay, cool. So I'm a writing teacher. I've taught English at I taught at City College of San Francisco for many years, and I started out tutoring students with disabilities and sort of learning about, maybe even before the universal design for learning model, but the idea of let's try different modalities. And so I guess I've become excited about the possibilities here, but also concerned about, are we using AI to support thinking and learning, or are we using it to sort of take the place of the learning process that we want students to have? And so I think having that conversation with students, and I think the accessibility community has a lot to offer the larger education discussion about AI, because these accessibility tools involving AI have been used probably for longer than people have been using ChatGPT. And so these questions about like, well, you still want to develop your own thoughts, even if you've got some auto prediction capability, or you've got some auto summarization, but what if it gets it wrong? Sort of like that education conversation that probably happens with counselors, with students with disabilities using these this kind of adaptive software these are now conversations that students need to have broadly if we're thinking about how they might use AI as part of the learning process. And I saw an interesting discussion on Twitter I saw people with disabilities, or I think dyslexia, posting about using ChatGPT as an aid, and it being sort of an amazing aid to getting ideas out into writing. And then I saw someone else posting saying, I have a communication disorder, and the problem is that it doesn't know what I'm trying to say. And so, not wanting to let this tool take over and put words in my mouth, and maybe take what I'm trying to say in a different direction from what I might have come up with. So still protecting some space for thinking while still using the tool as a way to encourage or to draw out. That would be the goal that I would see. And I've been playing with it myself. I just tried, I was getting stuck in the writing process, and I said, I think I could talk this out in a really, really raw, way that sounds terrible. So I used Otter AI, and just to have a transcript of what I was saying. And then I fed that transcript to ChatGPT, and I asked it to pull out some like bullet point key ideas. And the transcript was a mess. I mean, there were like ums and pauses and like me talking about sort of nothing for long periods, and there were no paragraph breaks, and it really was a mess. And I was afraid to actually read through it because it was pretty overwhelming. And so that really did help me, because the bullet points pulled out a number of key points that did reflect what I was trying to say. Some of them didn't make sense. And some of them were wrong, but I had enough expertise to like notice that and know that. And I didn't use the wording from ChatGPT, but I then started a new document where I was writing, but I used that bullet point list to help me think about how to structure my piece. So, I just see a lot of potential for multimodal writing process interventions that could support thinking rather than taking the place of thinking. Yeah, I was going to share that. And I don't want to talk too long. I'm sure people have questions, and Elle has ideas. But,
Yeah, anybody, feel free to post your questions or comments or thoughts in the chat, or unmute as you like, camera on or off. We'd love to hear from you. While you're thinking about that, that really was spurring my thought process about, we want students to take notes, right? Because I think that's a valuable way to engage with the material. But I also see in my own work, when talking and working with students, is that they'll record an entire lecture. They'll go to a lecture and they'll record it. Usually it's only audio, but sometimes if it's on Zoom or another format, they can have some video with that. But 9 times out of 10, they're not going to go back and listen to that entire lecture, right? They're like us, they're busy, right? And so when we're thinking about how can we take that that opportunity and still allow them to express themselves and build on their thinking and take notes and do that kind of content collaboration, even if it's with an AI tool, you can throw that audio into any of the, I know you mentioned one, there's a bunch of others that we use at the College of Marin, and I work with some of my students, especially those who might have, dyslexia or speech aphasia, or they might be on the spectrum. Regardless, there's a lot of underrepresented students who, might need this particular service. But I think more generally, when we're thinking about universal design, I think this can actually benefit most folks, right? And, not just students. I love feeding that audio in and having it, return, the 10, what it thinks are the 10 most relevant talking points. And then maybe I'll scrub through it, right? Especially if I can use, again, AI to turn that audio into a transcript, and then kind of review it very quickly. Oh, okay, here's where the instructor said, listen to this will be on the test, right? Or this is an important point here. And so going through that and then pulling those data elements out and making that part of your learning process, right? So it just really just shortens the time to get to that place where we're taking good notes that we can then refer back to them and then use them as study aids. Anybody else want to contribute or have any thoughts on that?
I just think it's such a valuable perspective, and sort of there's this searching to figure out what's the right balance and what do I need to access my education and my potential, and what struggle is productive and what struggle is not for each learner. So I think that students with disabilities are, developing that self-awareness about their learning process and about what kind of struggle is productive and what's not, and what kind of assistance helps their learning and what kind of assistance is too much or is not helpful, in collaboration with counselors and with their teachers. But so that's the exact kind of conversation that each student needs to have now in thinking about how or whether to use AI, especially generative AI, because that goes so far beyond what was possible, even though it still has limitations and flaws. So I think it's like there's a lot of parallels to the conversations I'm hearing around, when would you, some teachers are asking students to use AI and as part of the process. But again, we need that kind of those guidelines and that understanding that sometimes it's going to interfere and sometimes it's going to help. Sometimes people romanticize the struggle, like of the writing process, and say, well, you have to sweat through it. And it's like, well, I could have sweated through reading the transcript of my own brainstorm, and maybe I would have gotten a few other things out of that, but it would also have taken me a lot of time and involved a lot of stress. And that wasn't necessarily like worth it or better, I think. However, it is important for me not to like tell ChatGPT to do a brainstorm or to write a draft. That's important to me because I do need to be shaping the ideas myself and wrestling with them myself, and that is going to continue to be challenging. So I don't know. It's just one example of I'm continuing to wrestle with that. And I got some pushback on Twitter of like, well, maybe, maybe it becomes too easy, and we're missing the friction that's part of the writing process that's important. It's like, yeah, that's the question I should be asking myself. So that kind of metacognitive awareness of the learning process that I think is such a strength that students develop as they figure out their disabilities, is something everybody could benefit from, especially in relation to AI.
Yeah, I think you hit on an important point and topic there where, we really, when we're working with folks in access and accessibility, we're really trying to move the friction or the point of frustration from like the technology, right? Or, the barriers to their educational outcome and opportunities, right? And shift that friction to where it belongs, where it's, really engaging with the learning process, right? We still want folks to do that, but we don't want the friction or the barriers to be, in the way of that, because oftentimes they'll approach those and then, they don't have the grit or the resilience or the perseverance, and they'll just get dead-ended, right? And that's not the barrier we want them to come up against, right? We want them to have that kind of thoughtful, intentional, mindful process where it's still work, right? You're still struggling with your thinking, but that's where the friction is, right? Rather than, oh, I got to learn this new thing, right? Or this is a struggle because, I process information better, through this mode versus that mode, right? Or these two modes together, right? So I think that's really important to think about when we're engaging with our students in creating our course content and designing our courses, whether they're online or in person, right?
I love that. That's so helpful to think about. Is the friction where it should be? Because I was feeling like I couldn't sit at the computer and I couldn't type. I couldn't face the blank page, but I could speak. So if I'm still producing words, let me struggle with what the word should be, but I shouldn't have to struggle with a particular technology around the words. I mean, writing itself is a technology, and sitting at the computer brings sensory challenges. I was able to go outside and be in my garden while I was speaking my ideas for my essay. So yeah, I mean, that sort of removed unnecessary friction in my mind. And that's using transcription. But even working with the brainstorm, I knew I could go through and highlight particular ideas and pick out what was interesting. Um, but I wasn't sure that the friction of looking through all the ums and uhs and is this what I'm really talking about, like garbage that was part of the brainstorm, was actually useful. So that's partly why I chose to have the auto kind of summarization or pulling out key points.
It's okay.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I just wanted to jump in because a couple segments ago, Dr. Mills mentioned metacognition, and that's my course is called How to Learn with Your Mobile Device, and it's really hiding broccoli under the cheese, where they're gaining metacognitive skills, but they are doing it in the context of using the technology to implement learning strategies. So I'm wondering if you all have envisioned ways to empower students with diverse abilities to use artificial intelligence tools to generate strategies for them to improve their learning experiences, whether it be things that they can do because nobody learns how to learn in the learning process. It's stuff that, I wish I had learned when I was younger, but it didn't until I entered an education program. But it might be things that they can do to support their own success, things that their teachers could do, or other people in the whole learning pathway, whether it be student support, staff members, or even friends, relatives, classmates, etc. So I'm wondering, knowing that there's literature out there that AI might mine, that has research shows that students can do this to support if they have this challenge or this need or this accommodation or whatever. Maybe just getting both of your take on how AI could be used as an empowerment engine.
That's such a cool idea. I hadn't thought about, I've thought about asking ChatGPT for like writing feedback and about how students could customize that. They could say like, I'm really stuck. I just want to hear what my strengths are. But I love the idea of saying, here are my challenges and here's the assignment. What are some strategies that could help me? And just, give me 20 and maybe half of them are not going to work for me, or give me 3. And I can imagine assignments where students might have a dialogue with something like ChatGPT and then sort of save that dialogue and maybe reflect on it further, or have an entry where they say, here, ChatGPT suggested this, which made me think of this, and I tried this, and here's how it went. So yeah, I like that there's a tool where that saves your conversations. Of course, there's still the privacy issues and the question of, do we want to require students to make an account with OpenAI and do this? So maybe offering an alternative. But I like this tool, Share GPT, that makes like a web page out of a chat session. Of course, if they're sharing personal information about their challenges, then that might be, I don't know, questionable. But one thing I've done is to create sample chat sessions and share the website of those sample sessions and have the students sort of just comment on that. So yeah.
Thanks. I've been working on this in my spare time, uh, thinking about this exact topic, right? Creating this very structured, but also nuanced own LLM, right? This very tightly learned chat model, right? Thinking about how students can interact with that and use it as a kind of an equity engine, right? An accommodations engine. Because that's quite literally, and I don't know if this is going to, again, put me into the category of writing myself out of a role, right? But that's literally what I do, right? I meet with students and I say, okay, let me look at your, your AAP, all of those things. Let me have an interactive process with you. Okay, here's what I think would work best for you. And let's leverage those technologies so you can really get back to learning, put the focus rather on the learning and have that technology be an extension of you in your learning process, right? Your learning abilities, rather than having it be a barrier, right? And we really can only do that with self models, right? Or models that you create yourselves, because those solo LLMs have to be they have to really be reined in. You have to really be careful about creating those guardrails, right? And only feed them the information that's going to be relevant to your use case. And of course, that also brings in the concept of, well, how do we be mindful about these when it comes to equity and bias, right? Because most of the models out there are trained on the internet. And as we know, academic writing and the internet is biased, right? Because, most AIs like ChatGPT are biased because the internet is biased, right? It has a certain slant from certain groups, lots of folks who are underrepresented there, right? To name a few. So really thinking about, I caught this talk just last week about they don't think that they're going to have any increase in success or kind of accurateness, right? Rather than truthiness. That's not what we're talking about, because it doesn't know if it's true or not. But just that accuracy, they've kind of hit a wall as far as the size of the LLM, right? So I think having some of those open source LLMs that you can bring online, maybe it could be housed, at a department level, right? Or at a college level. And that could be a very focused, unitasker that, it's like the melon baller in your kitchen drawer, right? It only does one thing, but it does it quite well.
Can I just understand? So you're talking about like creating a model that would be just for education, that's specifically trained only on sort of texts that are worthwhile, that we think give good ideas for learning strategies, for example.
Right, exactly. And
So
like
that we
thinking
could trust
about,
it more.
right, thinking about how that process, not only the product, but the process that you go into it, really be mindful about training that data, right? Because we all have a large wealth of knowledge, right? We're all, I think, in some ways or another, masters of our knowledge spaces or subject matter experts, right? But how can we condense that knowledge into a model that's going to be useful, right? And kind of have our own little chatbot, for instance. I know a lot of students would love to, ask me questions 24 hours a day. And wouldn't it be great if they had that ability, not for complex, nuanced questions, right? But for simple, oh, I forgot, how do you do that thing again? Or, what's your schedule for the next week? Or, very kind of, accurately and easily verified questions, right? And then, oh, well, that seems like it's a more nuanced topic. Please make an appointment with so-and-so, right? But, really thinking about how can we deliver and develop those kinds of models for our students, because I think they're going to want them, right?
Yeah, but they
Whether
also
we,
still need that relationship with the teacher
right,
and a sense of support. And maybe there are moments where they might be interacting with a chatbot where you would want them to be able to say, is this right? Or I'm not sure what to make of this, or to sort of bring in the teacher. And maybe that's where the metacognitive reflection piece comes in. So if we're creating a structure that anticipates that need and that still builds in relationship, um, that's a lot better than just saying, okay, um, you know, go with the chatbot's suggestions. Obviously, we wouldn't do that, but
yeah, well, we would have to build in scaffolding like we do now, right? But I think having that opportunity and having that available to students, I think would be, a great equalizer across the board. And it can actually, show our students like that data literacy piece, right? Here's something that's transparent, right? Because we would make it transparent because we would own the LLM, right? And we would say, here's what it's good for, just like you put in the syllabus. And perhaps here's not what it's good for, right? And so we can create those guardrails without hesitation or that lack of transparency that some of the AI models that exist now that are more generalized, right? And of course, this comes from my background. Shout out to my family member who was a LD specialist at Marin College for 20 years. So I know a little something about LD assessment. So thinking about those things, right? And how do we kind of distill the finer points of that interactive process while still benefiting from that scaffolding, that personal interaction, right? I'm sure counselors would love more time in their meeting to actually communicate effectively with their students, or at office hours with faculty, right? Let's let the technology and AI do what it's good at and let people do what they're good at.
yeah, because I would imagine that, you might try a strategy, but having this person who knows you and sees what your struggle is, and then how it goes when you try something, and they see your evolution over time, it has that value in itself. But maybe that person you could get more out of the session with that person um, if you kind of already had some dialogue about nuts and bolts, like many people with this challenge try these things, and then you've already come in prepped and thought about how that would go for you and what the barriers would be to using that strategy, or you've tried it and you want to troubleshoot with the counselor. So yeah, I mean, maybe you could start from a further point if you had that additional form of interaction.
And I put in the chat that that might be a way to create a lower barrier to entry or engagement, because there are a certain population, and during the pandemic, the California Community College Student Senate conducted a survey that found that the students who are most likely to need support, the ones who are at high risk of dropping out or not being successful in their courses, are the least likely to self-advocate. And so if you give them a space where they can interact with a non-human agent who doesn't have judgment, then they might be able, and then that might, if you build in responses that have a warm transfer, hey, this really sounds like you should reach out to someone. And I've got some suggestions about how to do that. So it's not just, hey, call your teacher, but these are the questions you should be asking, or these are the facts that you need to make sure you convey. Frankly, in the medical field, there's probably similar needs where people who are grappling with a life-threatening illness are dealing with stress and anxiety and can't communicate the way they'd like, or can't retain what they've been told when they're in this situation. I would love to see this conversation go on forever, but we have reached the end of our time, and I want to respect folks who may have other things that they need to get to, whether it be picking up kids in the US, or if it's for those folks. I know we have a colleague from Guam Community College who's probably ready to get to breakfast. So either way, thank you, Elle and Dr. Mills. This has been a really great way to end our second day of the conference. I've already grabbed your link, Elle, and I've put a link to your slides from the session description on the website. And then folks, stay tuned, because day 3 is just around the corner. As a matter of fact, Guam may already be in tomorrow, so they're just waiting for them to happen. And we are too. So then I'm going to stop the recording, but not without again thanking our presenters for ending the day with a really rich discussion. And we look forward to seeing everybody at the rest of the Peralta Online Equity Conference tomorrow.
Cheers, everyone.
Thanks for having us.